On a
Another
scorching
day,
afternoon in the quiet
another
riverside town of
town.
Maple Ridge, the small
For
diner
Jim
felt
Walker,
heavy with
the war
exhaustion.
was never truly
At a corner
over.
booth, U.S.
He
veteran
just
Jim Walker
carried
was
it
quietly
differently
drinking his
now.
coffee, while Rex,
Look
his
at
loyal
you,
German
trembling.
shepherd, rested
You're
at his feet,
pathetic.
watching the room with the
Bring me the
alertness of a
manager
trained
right
protector.
now.
Then it happened. A middle-aged waitress was suddenly humiliated by the richest brat in town, yelled at, insulted, and pushed to her breaking point right in front of everyone. The entire diner froze in uncomfortable silence. But not Jim, and definitely not Rex. In an instant, Jim rose to his feet and Rex moved into position beside him. What they did next shattered the fear that had ruled the town for years, exposed the bully's lies, and proved that sometimes all it takes is one veteran and his loyal dog to change everything. The afternoon heat in Maple Ridge pressed down like a heavy hand, turning the quiet riverside town into a shimmering haze of baked asphalt and slow-moving shadows. The air clung to the skin, thick and syrupy, carrying the faint scent of river mud and the metallic tang of old boat engines from the small shipyard nearby. Maple Ridge was the kind of place where summer slowed everything to a crawl. Even the cicadas seemed to scream in slow motion. Cars rolled lazily past cracked sidewalks, and porch dogs barely lifted their heads to acknowledge them. In this heat-soaked stillness, a dusty Ford pickup turned onto Main Street, its engine grumbling as if protesting the weather. Behind the wheel sat Jim Walker, a 50-year-old American veteran whose broad-shouldered frame filled the driver's seat with easy stability. His face bore no scars, but years of service and long stretches on lonely highways had carved faint, thoughtful lines around his eyes. His clean-shaven jaw and steady gaze carried a quiet authority, the kind earned through hardship rather than words. Jim wore a faded green shirt and well-worn jeans, clothing that matched his unassuming, practical nature. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He sought only places where he could breathe, sit, and let the world be still for a moment. In the passenger seat sat Rex, his 4-year-old German shepherd with a powerful build and a sleek black and tan coat that caught the sunlight even inside the truck. Rex's amber eyes scanned every corner of the street with the hyper-awareness of a trained protector. His ears moved like small radar dishes, catching distant sounds, a bicycle chain rattling, a door slamming, a gull crying near the river. Rex was calm, disciplined, and almost unnervingly intelligent. To Jim, he was not just a dog, he was a partner, a guardian, and a grounding force that kept the ghosts of the past at bay. When Jim parked the truck, Rex sat upright, ready. The Harbor Crest Cafe sat at the corner of Main Street like an aging landmark refusing to fade away. Once painted a cheerful coastal blue, its walls had surrendered to years of sun and humidity, turning into a softer, weathered tone. A neon sign buzzed stubbornly above the entrance, flickering in protest against the sweltering air. Inside, the cafe smelled of brewed coffee, griddled toast, and lemon cleaning spray. Slow, old ceiling fans worked tirelessly above a few scattered customers. Jim pushed open the door, and the soft chime overhead rang like a tired greeting that fit perfectly with the rest of the decor. Behind the counter stood Martha Lane, a 45-year-old waitress with a slim frame and soft features that had grown weary from long weeks and longer nights. Her dark brown hair was tied back into a low bun that had loosened in the heat, and faint shadows beneath her eyes hinted at the strain of caring for a sick mother while working double shifts. Her smile was gentle but fragile, like something kept in place through sheer determination. Martha had a polite, unassuming presence, someone used to being overlooked but still trying to give kindness wherever she could. When she saw Jim enter, she offered a small, genuine nod, as if grateful for a new face. Jim chose a booth in the far corner, the kind of seat any seasoned veteran would instinctively choose, one with a clear view of the door and the entire dining room. Rex settled immediately at his feet, lying down with practiced discipline. Martha approached with a laminated menu and a pot of fresh coffee, her movements steady, but slowed slightly by exhaustion. She poured Jim's coffee with a soft, apologetic smile and set a small bowl of water on the floor for Rex. The German Shepherd examined her closely but remained respectful and calm, easing the tension in her shoulders. "You passing through?" Martha asked, her voice carrying a faint southern rasp shaped by years of conversation, coffee steam, and worn-out mornings. Jim nodded and replied simply, "For now." It wasn't dismissive, just honest. Martha seemed to understand the kind of man he was, brief in words, heavy in experience. She refilled his coffee and glanced down at Rex, her eyes widening slightly at his size, but softening when she saw the gentle focus in his expression. Even exhausted, she found a small spark of warmth for the well-trained dog at Jim's feet. Jim took his first sip of coffee, letting its warmth spread through him in a way that felt almost healing. Rex rested his head on his paws, but never stopped tracking the room with quiet precision. A handful of older patrons sat along the counter, stirring their drinks in slow circles. A country song hummed faintly from the radio, blending with the occasional clatter from the kitchen. Nothing in the cafe was remarkable, yet Jim found a rare, temporary peace settling around him. His shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, something that didn't happen often. He watched Martha move around the cafe. She had a quiet grace, even in her fatigue, and a way of straightening plates or wiping counters that revealed both habit and pride. Every so often she pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, revealing a look in her eyes that told stories of responsibility and worry. Jim recognized that look. He had seen it in towns across the country, in people carrying too much without complaint. It reminded him why he preferred small places like this. They were full of quiet fighters, people who bore their burdens in silence. The afternoon heat continued to press against the cafe windows, casting golden slices of sunlight across Jim's table. Rex shifted slightly, leaning into Jim's boot with a soft, reassuring weight familiar to both of them. Outside, cicadas screamed louder, as if trying to outdo the heat itself. Inside, everything remained calm and still, a fleeting, fragile calm that neither Jim nor Rex had any reason to distrust. They did not yet know that Maple Ridge, beneath its sleepy surface, held storms waiting to break. For now, the cafe remained deceptively peaceful. The heat outside continued to press against the cafe windows, but inside, the atmosphere had softened into something warmer, more human. Jim Walker lifted his cup for another slow sip as the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted toward him. Across the room, Martha Lane moved with quiet determination, despite the fatigue weighing heavily on her shoulders. Jim noticed how she paused every few minutes, resting her hand briefly on the counter as if catching her breath. Something about her movements reflected a deeper story, one shaped not by dramatic events, but by the relentless demands of survival in a small, forgotten town. Rex watched her too, his amber eyes following her with curious empathy. When Martha approached Jim's table again, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, the overhead light revealed the subtle tremble in her wrists. She did her best to hide it behind a practiced smile, but Jim had spent too many years reading people to miss the truth. Martha's brown eyes, usually soft and patient, now carried a dull sheen of exhaustion. Her skin, naturally warm-toned, looked pale beneath the cafe's yellow lights. Her messy low bun, strands falling loosely around her temples, suggested she hadn't had time for herself in days. Still, her smile remained sincere as she topped off Jim's cup. "You doing all right over here?" she asked gently. Jim nodded, observing her carefully. He was not the type to pry, but he recognized the signs of someone carrying more than she let on. "You've been on your feet a while," he said, his voice calm but perceptive. Martha chuckled softly, though the sound carried a hint of sadness. "Feels like forever. Double shifts aren't exactly kind to the body, but someone's got to cover things." Jim didn't push further, but his eyes asked the unspoken question. After a moment, Martha answered it with a sigh. "My mom's been real sick. Medication's expensive. Insurance doesn't cover the kind she needs." She shrugged, trying to brush off the weight of her words. Rex lifted his head, sensing the tension. Martha glanced down at Rex, her expression softening as she crouched slightly to offer him a gentle smile. "He's a handsome boy," she said, reaching out her hand carefully. Rex sniffed politely, then allowed her to rest her fingers against his head. "Rex is 4, Jim explained. "Smartest partner I've had." Martha's smile brightened just a little. Dogs had a way of drawing the truth out of people and reminding them that kindness still existed. "He looks like he can sense everything," she murmured. There was admiration in her voice, maybe even a flicker of comfort. Jim watched her interact with Rex and felt something shift, a subtle connection forming. When Martha straightened again, the effort looked heavier than it should have been. Jim noticed the faint limp in her left leg, something she tried hard to hide. "Old injury?" he asked gently. Martha blinked, startled he'd noticed. "Just a slip on the stairs a few months ago," she said. "Didn't have time to rest it properly. Work doesn't stop, you know?" Jim nodded in silent understanding. He knew all too well the kind of life where stopping simply wasn't an option. She rubbed the back of her neck, revealing tense muscles and stiff posture, signs of someone who'd carried too much weight for too long. Her resilience impressed him. A bell rang from the kitchen, and a man's deep voice called out, "Order up!" The cook, Frank Dillard, appeared briefly at the window, a stocky man in his late 40s with a scruffy beard, thick eyebrows, and a gruff expression softened only by the heat rising from the grill. His apron bore old stains, and his demeanor suggested a man who didn't talk much but cared about the cafe more than he'd admit. Frank caught Martha's eye and gestured toward the ready plate with a nod that was gruff but supportive. Even in his roughness, Jim sensed a protective instinct in him, the kind found in people who had spent years working alongside others who struggled. Martha excused herself to pick up the plate, wincing slightly as she shifted her weight onto her sore leg. Jim watched her carefully, recognizing the strain beneath her determined steps. She delivered the meal to an older customer, a thin, gray-haired man named Mr. Keaton, who wore thick glasses and a flannel shirt despite the heat. Mr. Keaton thanked her with a gentle nod, revealing a soft-spoken personality shaped by years of living quietly on the outskirts of town. Martha responded with her usual warmth before returning to the counter, where she placed a hand on her hip and exhaled deeply, unaware that Jim and Rex were still watching with concern. After a moment, Martha returned to Jim's table, rubbing her arm absent-mindedly as though trying to ease an ache. "I don't usually talk about myself," she said, "but I guess sometimes it feels good just to say things out loud." Jim gave a small, understanding smile. "Talking helps," he replied, "even if it doesn't fix everything." Martha nodded, her eyes softening. "People around here don't always get it. Maple Ridge can be a lonely place when you're struggling." She glanced around the empty tables, the atmosphere heavy with silence. "But we get by, one shift at a time." Jim admired her resilience. Quiet, uncelebrated strength. Rex shifted closer to Jim as the cafe lights flickered, the old wiring humming in the walls. The dog's presence seemed to steady Martha as she lingered for a moment longer. "You and Rex bring a different energy," she said softly. "Feels calmer with you two here." Jim didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded in acknowledgement. Outside, the cicadas screamed louder, and a burst of summer wind rattled the cafe windows. Martha looked toward the door, as though bracing for something. Jim followed her gaze, sensing the subtle change. In atmosphere. A quiet tension, a calm before a storm the town had grown used to expecting. For now, though, the cafe remained peaceful. Martha thanked Jim for listening before returning behind the counter, where she steadied herself with a deep breath. Jim watched her with renewed understanding, seeing not just a tired waitress, but a woman fighting daily battles with dignity. Rex rested his chin on Jim's boot, his body relaxed but alert. Jim took another sip of coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground him. He understood now that this town carried more weight than its quiet streets suggested, and that Martha Lane, with her weary smile and quiet strength, had become part of a story he had not expected to walk into. But storms were coming. Jim could feel it. The cafe's quiet rhythm settled again as Martha returned behind the counter, steadying herself with a slow breath. Jim Walker watched her with growing concern, sensing the fatigue beneath her composure. Rex lay at Jim's feet, his ears flicking toward every small sound. Nothing seemed out of place, just another slow, humid afternoon in Maple Ridge, until the shrill roar of a high-performance engine shattered the stillness. The screech of tires cut through the heat-laden air outside the cafe like a blade, and both Jim and Rex lifted their heads at the same moment. Rex's body tensed immediately, every muscle coiling with instinctive alertness. The cafe door slammed open so violently that the bell above it clanged against the frame. Striding inside was Carter Sloan, the notorious son of Sloan Industries' CEO, heir to the wealthiest and most powerful family in Maple Ridge. Carter was 25 years old, tall, lean but toned from expensive gym memberships rather than real work. He wore a perfectly fitted white polo shirt, designer sunglasses perched arrogantly atop his slick blonde hair, and a gold watch so large it seemed designed purely to be noticed. His face, handsome in a polished and privileged way, held a permanent smirk, the expression of someone who had never heard the word no and had never faced consequence. Carter paused just inside the entrance, surveying the cafe like a king displeased with his throne room. His pale blue eyes swept across the space with disdain, lingering on the cracked counter, the old tiles, and the handful of customers who instantly dropped their gazes. The air tightened with unspoken fear. Carter's reputation wasn't just rumor. He was known for cruelty that hid beneath a practiced charm, and the town tolerated him because his father funded half its infrastructure. Rex growled low, almost silent, his amber eyes locked onto Carter's every move. Jim placed a steadying hand on Rex's back, but he kept watching. Without acknowledging anyone, Carter strutted toward the counter, his designer loafers clicking sharply on the tiled floor. Martha stiffened the moment she saw him. Her shoulders tensed, her breath caught. She straightened her apron, doing her best to mask her dread. "Good afternoon, Carter," she said softly, keeping her tone polite despite the tremor in her voice. Carter didn't respond. Instead, he tapped his knuckles on the counter impatiently, his expression twisting into irritation. "Service," he barked, loud enough for every customer to hear. "Let's go. I don't have all day. Some of us actually have important things to do." Martha forced a small smile, though her hands gripped the water pitcher too tightly. "Right away," she murmured. She moved with caution, each step betraying exhaustion. Carter watched her with predatory amusement, tapping his large gold ring against the countertop. His jaw shifted as he chewed on invisible annoyance, and when Martha finally set a clean glass in front of him and reached to pour water, Carter made his move. He jerked his arm suddenly, pretending to adjust his watch. The deliberate motion slammed into Martha's wrist, knocking the pitcher sideways. Water cascaded over the counter and splashed across Martha's shirt, soaking the thin fabric. The cafe fell into suffocating silence. Martha gasped softly, startled by the cold spill. Her cheeks flushed as she stumbled back, clutching the dripping pitcher. Carter leaned back with a satisfied smile, admiring the mess he'd created as if it were art. "Incredible," he drawled. "You can't even pour water without ruining someone's day. Do they hire anyone with a pulse in this dump?" His voice slithered through the room, dripping with cruelty. Martha's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with humiliation she desperately tried to hide. Her fingers tightened around the pitcher to keep them from shaking. Jim's posture changed subtly, the calm ease replaced by a quiet alertness. He didn't stand, not yet, but Rex rose onto his elbows, head forward, muscles taut. Jim's jaw flexed, though his expression remained controlled. He watched Carter with the same focus he used to assess danger in foreign deserts and hostile villages. Carter, oblivious or dismissive, continued his tirade. "You're lucky my shirt didn't get ruined," he sneered, brushing imaginary droplets from his immaculate polo. "This cost more than your entire paycheck." Martha breathed shakily, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Carter," her voice barely audible. Carter wasn't done. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it between two fingers like something filthy. His lips curled into a cruel grin before he flicked the bill toward the puddle on the floor. It landed in the pool of water with a soft slap, instantly soaking through. "There," he said mockingly. "That's your tip. Pick it up before it dries." The cafe went dead silent again. Every customer froze, trapped between fear of the Sloan family and the instinctive urge to defend Martha. Even Frank Dillard peeked out from the kitchen window, his brow furrowed deeply beneath his scruffy beard, though he dared not intervene. Martha stared at the drenched bill, her breath unsteady, her shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of exhaustion, embarrassment, and unwanted attention. Her hands hesitated at her sides, trembling from stress and from the conflict between dignity and necessity. A fresh shift of dread crossed her face, the kind of dread born from long weeks of pressure, sick relatives, and cruel people who knew exactly how trapped she was. Slowly, painfully, she bent her knees a fraction, reaching toward the floor. Jim saw her movement and felt something inside him coil tight. Rex stood fully now, silent but imposing, his gaze fixed on Carter with unwavering intensity. Jim rose with steady, deliberate calm, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the cafe floor. The tension in the room seized instantly. Jim didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the balance of the room's energy. Carter's smirk faltered when he sensed the shift, turning his head slightly toward the corner booth where Jim had been sitting. Jim's eyes, steady and cold, met his with a weight that froze Carter mid-breath. Rex stood at Jim's heel, posture rigid, trained, ready. Carter straightened in defiance, forcing the smirk back onto his face. "You got a problem, old man?" he demanded, though his voice wavered slightly. Jim didn't move closer. He simply stood tall, the embodiment of a boundary Carter had crossed without realizing it. Martha remained frozen, halfway bent, eyes wide with fear and disbelief at what might happen next. The cafe customers stared with hope and dread tangled together. Carter turned fully toward Jim, swallowing down the panic rising in him. But the damage had already been done. His arrogance had finally met something immovable. The room held its breath as the tension thickened, setting the stage for a confrontation Maple Ridge had not seen in years. The bully had revealed himself fully, and now he stood face to face with a man who didn't fear money, power, or consequences. Jim Walker didn't rise for many things anymore, but he rose for this. Martha Lane froze in her half-bent posture, her right hand trembling inches above the soaked $100 bill. The humiliation weighed on her like a physical force, pressing down on her shoulders until her breath came shallow and shaky. The entire cafe had gone silent, the air still as if even the heat outside had paused to witness the moment. Her tired brown eyes glistened, reflecting both exhaustion and the painful familiarity of being powerless before people like Carter Sloane. Then suddenly, a heavy boot stepped into view. Jim Walker's worn military-style boot, the sole scarred from years of use. He lowered it firmly onto the wet bill, pinning it to the floor before Martha's fingertips reached it. Martha straightened slowly, confusion flickering through her expression. She lifted her gaze and saw Jim standing tall before her, the cafe's dim lights reflecting off his weather-hardened features. Jim's clean-shaven jaw was set with quiet certainty, and his penetrating blue eyes held the kind of calm that made even the bravest men rethink their next word. His military cold-weather parka, thick fabric, high collar, dual zippers, made him seem even larger, like a wall of discipline and purpose. Rex moved in beside him, the 4-year-old German shepherd standing with perfect posture, chest forward, ears alert, amber eyes locked on Carter with unwavering focus. Carter Sloane stared at the boot covering his tip, his face twisting from surprise to immediate indignation. His pale blue eyes sharpened, and his smirk reappeared as he leaned back in false confidence. "Move your foot," Carter sneered, crossing his arms over his designer polo. His voice wavered just slightly, betraying a crack in his arrogance. Jim didn't move. His posture was relaxed but commanding, the controlled stance of a man who had diffused real threats, not spoiled tantrums. The cafe's customers watched in breathless anticipation. Even Frank Dillard peeked from the kitchen window, jaw clenched, ready to intervene if needed. Jim's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. Instead, it carried the kind of quiet authority that silenced entire rooms. "Pick it up," he said, his tone flat and unyielding. Carter blinked, uncomprehending for a second. Jim held his gaze. "You threw the money. You made the mess. Pick it up," he continued, articulating each word with precision. The entire cafe froze. Never in Maple Ridge had anyone spoken to Carter Sloane like that. Not a teacher, not a neighbor, not even law enforcement who depended on his father's donations. Carter's cheeks reddened as embarrassment prickled beneath his skin. "What are you, the janitor?" Carter snapped, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "This doesn't concern you, old man." Jim didn't flinch. "It concerns me now," he replied calmly. He shifted his weight forward by a fraction, enough to communicate that he wasn't backing down. Rex mirrored the movement, taking a single step closer, his body a model of trained discipline. The sound of his claws clicking on the tile echoed like a warning. Martha, standing just behind Jim, brought a hand to her mouth, unsure whether to stop him or let him continue. Her heart hammered painfully, both hopeful and terrified. Carter puffed out his chest and stepped closer to Jim, attempting to reclaim dominance. Up close, Carter's carefully curated appearance, slick blonde hair, evenly tanned skin, the faint scent of expensive cologne, felt strangely out of place against Jim's rugged presence. Carter pointed to the soaked bill under Jim's boot. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he taunted. But his voice betrayed him. Jim's eyes remained unreadable, calm, but with a sharp edge beneath the surface. "Yes," Jim answered simply. "You crossed a line. Now fix it." The simplicity of the command rattled Carter more than any threat could have. The tension in the cafe grew thick enough to feel. A fork clattered somewhere in the back, as one of the older patrons, Mr. Keaton, jerked nervously. Martha glanced around the room, seeing customers staring at Jim as though he had stepped out of a legend. Frank Dillard gripped the edge of the pass-through window so tightly his knuckles turned white. Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He opened his mouth to speak again, but then Rex let out a single, low growl. Deep, controlled, a sound that seemed to rise from the floorboards. Carter's bravado faltered. He took an involuntary half-step back. "You want her to pick up the money you threw?" Jim asked, his tone firmer now, though still eerily calm. "She won't. You will. Apologize while you're at it." Carter's face went scarlet. No one had dared command him since childhood, and even then, only his father, Richard Sloane, had ever spoken to him in a tone approaching authority. Years of unearned privilege crashed against Jim's immovable stance. Carter drew himself up and barked, "You have no idea who I am." Jim didn't blink. "I don't care who you are." The reply struck Carter like a blow. The customers held their breath. Carter looked around the cafe, seeking support, but all he found were eyes watching him with a mixture of disgust and anticipation. The air conditioning rattled weakly in the ceiling as if groaning under the weight of tension. Carter's confidence cracked, revealing the frightened boy beneath the expensive clothes. His fists clenched at his sides, his chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. Rex maintained his stance, shoulders squared, jaws subtly tense. Finally, Carter exhaled sharply. He bent down, his movements stiff and resentful, and snatched the soaked bill from beneath Jim's boot. He straightened, glaring at Jim with hatred burning behind his eyes. "Apologize," Jim said again. This time the word carried an edge that brooked no argument. Carter's jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. He looked at Martha, who stood small and trembling behind Jim. Her brown eyes widened not with fear now, but disbelief. Carter swallowed hard, the fight draining from his posture as the entire cafe waited. Then, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Sorry." The word was barely audible. Jim tilted his head. Louder. Carter glared at him, then forced the word out again. "I said I'm sorry." Martha whispered, "It's all right," though her voice wavered, but everyone knew it wasn't. Humiliated, Carter backed away a step, still gripping the soggy bill. Rage simmered beneath his polished exterior, his breath coming unevenly. Jim remained steady, unmoving, with Rex standing like a sentry beside him. In that moment, Carter realized something he'd never felt before. Fear, not of violence but of consequence. His face pale now, he turned sharply and stormed toward the door, shoving it open so hard it slammed against the wall. The bell jingled violently behind him as he disappeared into the blistering sunlight. For the first time, the town's golden boy had been knocked off his pedestal. The door to the cafe slammed behind Carter as he stormed out, his polished loafers grinding gravel with each furious step. The blistering sun struck his already flushed face, turning his humiliation into a burning rage that coiled inside him like a wild animal. Carter Sloane, heir to the wealthiest family in Maple Ridge, had never been forced to apologize, never had to bend his pride before anyone. The sting of it throbbed like a bruise. He marched toward his silver sports car, breathing heavily, the $100 bill still clutched in his damp fingers. His pale blue eyes flicked back toward the cafe window, where Jim Walker's silhouette remained unmoving. A silent reminder of the moment Carter couldn't erase. Carter yanked open the car door and dropped into the driver's seat, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the frame. His chest rose and fell in angry bursts. For a moment he stared into the rearview mirror, seeing not the polished, confident young man he spent years crafting, but someone small, cornered, exposed. His blonde hair, once perfectly slicked back, had fallen slightly out of place, giving him a disheveled look that only fueled his fury. "He thinks he can embarrass me?" Carter hissed, running a shaking hand over his jaw. "In my town?" His pride demanded retaliation, and retaliation was always easy for someone whose family owned half the county. He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers and hit 3 digits. The 911 dispatcher answered quickly, a calm female voice. Carter forced panic into his tone, raising his voice high enough to sound desperate. "I need help! There's a dangerous homeless man at the Harbor Crest Cafe," he shouted. His breathing intensified theatrically as he continued. "He threatened me. He has a weapon, I think a knife, and he set a trained attack dog on me." He looked toward the cafe window again, lips curling into a twisted smile as he added, "Please, hurry. He's out of control." The dispatcher responded with urgency, and within seconds Carter could hear the typing on her end and the promise that officers were already en route. He hung up, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Inside the cafe, Martha Lane stood frozen near the counter, her exhausted features twisted in worry. She had watched Carter exit with that familiar look, the look of a man who intended to cause trouble, not end it. Martha rubbed her trembling hands on her apron and glanced toward Jim Walker, who had returned to his corner booth. Jim sat with calm certainty, one arm resting loosely on the table, the other hand gently touching Rex's head. Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a keen gaze, stayed close to Jim's leg, ears perked as though sensing the storm gathering outside. Martha approached slowly, fear overtaking her features. "Jim?" Martha whispered, her voice strained. "You should go, please." Jim lifted his gaze toward her, his calm blue eyes steady and unreadable. Martha's breath shook as she continued. "You don't understand the Sloan family. They can destroy lives here. They own the police. If Carter makes a call, they'll believe anything he says." Her brown eyes glistened with fear, not for herself, but for the man who had defended her when no one else dared. Jim studied her face for a long moment. He saw the exhaustion, the quiet terror, the too familiar resignation of someone who had lived under the shadow of power for too long. Rex nudged Martha's hand gently, sensing her distress. Jim's jaw tightened with quiet resolve. "I appreciate your concern," he said, voice low and steady, "but I don't run from bullies." His words were not spoken with bravado. They were spoken like a simple truth, carved into him over years of military service. Martha pressed her lips together, torn between her gratitude and her fear. "This isn't a battlefield, Jim," she whispered. "This is Maple Ridge. Here, money wins." Jim shook his head. Not today. Rex looked between the two humans, sensing the tension rising. He shifted his stance, sitting taller, ready. The minutes passed heavily, each one thick with unease. The cafe, once humming with quiet conversation, now sat in total stillness. Mr. Keaton, the elderly regular at the counter, wiped his glasses nervously even though they were clean. Frank Dillard, the gruff cook with a broad chest and dark beard, ducked out of the kitchen with worry in his eyes, crossing his thick arms in silent anticipation. "That boy's trouble," Frank muttered under his breath, glancing towards the window. "Always has been." His gravelly voice carried old bitterness, perhaps from past encounters with the Sloan family, though he didn't elaborate. The tension reached its peak when the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Martha flinched at the sound, her breath hitching in her throat. The sirens grew louder. Too many, too fast. The color drained from her face. "Oh no," she whispered. Jim remained still, but Rex rose, positioning himself between Jim and the door, instinctively ready to act. The sirens spiraled closer until blue and red lights flickered through the cafe windows like splintered lightning. 3 police cruisers swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching as they cut diagonally across the gravel. Dust erupted around them as officers jumped out before the engines had fully stopped. The air trembled with adrenaline and the sharp thump of boots hitting pavement. The first officer to emerge was Sergeant Roy Hansen, a man in his early 50s with a heavy build, thinning gray hair, and a square jaw that looked permanently clenched. His uniform was sharp, but his eyes, dark and narrow, revealed a man who carried grudges like medals. His broad shoulders suggested strength, but the tension in his posture hinted at insecurity buried beneath years of forced authority. He was known for enforcing the Sloan family's will, and the small-town fear he commanded was almost as infamous as Carter's arrogance. Sergeant Hansen placed a hand on his holster and scanned the cafe with a predator's glare. 2 younger officers followed behind him. Officer Lee, a woman in her late 20s with black hair tied in a tight bun and sharp cheekbones, gripped her radio nervously. Her uniform looked new, and so did her fear. Beside her, Officer Benton, early 30s, tall with a scruffy beard and broad shoulders, stepped forward with more confidence. But his eyes flickered with uncertainty as he glanced toward Hansen, waiting for cues. These weren't peacekeepers entering. They were hunters answering a call from their patron. The tension inside the cafe jumped instantly as the officers approached the door. Martha's breath shook violently now. She stepped toward Jim, reaching out as if to shield him somehow. "Please," she whispered. "Please go out the back. I'm begging you." Jim shook his head calmly. "If I leave, he wins," he said, voice firm. "He learns nothing." Rex leaned closer to Jim's leg, his stance shifting to one of readiness, loyal, disciplined, unwavering. The bell above the door jingled frantically as the officers burst inside. Sergeant Hansen drew his gun halfway from its holster, eyes locked on Jim before anyone had even spoken. The cafe filled with chaotic shouts, flying commands, and fear thick enough to choke the air. In that moment, Jim Walker understood that this was no misunderstanding. This was a setup. A calculated strike from a spoiled heir who couldn't handle humiliation. And now, the weight of Maple Ridge's corruption was barreling straight at him. Jim exhaled once, steady and unafraid, as Rex braced for whatever would follow. The cafe felt like it had shrunk into a pressure cooker as Sergeant Roy Hansen stormed inside, hand hovering over his holster, eyes fixed on Jim Walker as if the man were already convicted. The harsh red-blue police lights flickered across Jim's military parka and Rex's tense posture, making the moment crackle with tension. Jim stayed perfectly calm, his stance controlled and disciplined, while Rex kept tightly beside him, 4-year-old muscles coiled like a spring. The officers fanned out, creating a semicircle as if preparing to pin Jim against the wall. Meanwhile, the regular customers, usually quiet, weary people, felt fear rise in their chests, but none of it compared to the injustice they knew was about to unfold. Sergeant Hansen barked, "You, hands where I can see them." His voice was louder than necessary, fueled not by genuine caution, but by the arrogance of someone who expected full obedience. Jim slowly raised his hands halfway, palms open, keeping his voice even. "There's been a mistake," he said. "I didn't threaten anyone." Hanson's eyes narrowed, eager to assert dominance. "We got a call from a terrified civilian who reported a weapon and an aggressive dog," he snapped. Hearing that, Rex gave the softest growl. Quiet, but unmistakable. Jim placed a steady hand on Rex's collar to calm him, but Rex's amber eyes remained fixed on the officers with unblinking loyalty. Before Hanson could continue his intimidation, the cafe door swung open again, this time with furious purpose. Carter Sloane re-entered, hair still immaculate despite his tantrum, his polo shirt bright under the flashing lights. His pale blue eyes glimmered with vindictive satisfaction as he pointed at Jim dramatically. "That's him!" Carter said loudly, making sure every officer heard. "He threatened me. He set his dog on me. He's dangerous." His voice cracked with exaggerated fear, but the act was transparent, except to those who wanted to believe it. Hanson turned to Carter with immediate sympathy, his expression shifting to something close to servile respect. Carter stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest as if reliving trauma. "He pinned me against the counter," Carter embellished. "He screamed at me and—" "Enough," Martha Lane interrupted, voice shaking but unmistakably firm. Every head turned. Martha, normally timid, stood with her shoulders squared, apron still damp from the water Carter spilled earlier. Her tired eyes hardened with new resolve. "Sergeant," Martha said, "I saw everything. Carter Sloane was the one who came in yelling. Carter Sloane knocked the water on me. Carter Sloane threw the money. Jim Walker stepped in to protect me." The room vibrated with the shock of hearing her stand up to the most powerful family in town. Carter's face paled, then flushed beet red. "She's lying," he snapped, pointing at Martha as if she were an insect he could crush. But before he could say more, another voice joined in. Mr. Keaton, the elderly regular with silver hair and thick glasses. He stood from his stool, leaning heavily on his cane, but speaking with unwavering certainty. "I saw it too," he said. "Every word she said is true. That boy," he pointed at Carter, "is the one who started it." His voice, usually fragile, now carried decades of accumulated frustration. Carter stared at him, stunned that even the elderly had turned against him. A third voice chimed in. Frank Dillard, the burly cook with the rugged beard and thick arms. He stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. His brown eyes were steady as stone. "Sergeant," Frank said, "Carter barged in here like he owned the place. He pushed Martha around. He made a mess. Then he picked a fight with a man who didn't do a damn thing wrong." The officers exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Even Officer Benton, usually confident, shifted uneasily. Carter sputtered, "You can't, this is ridiculous." But no one allowed him to retake control. Then a deeper voice spoke from the far corner. Everyone turned to see Carlisle Harper, the owner of Harbor Crest Cafe, stepping forward. Carlisle was a man in his late 50s with a broad build, thick salt and pepper hair, and the weary look of someone who had worked with his hands his whole life. His flannel shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms toughened by decades of labor. Carlisle rarely involved himself in disputes. His nature was calm, patient, but injustice brought a fire to his otherwise gentle brown eyes. He crossed the room slowly and stood between Jim and the officers. Carlisle folded his arms, casting a level stare at Sergeant Hanson. "I run this place," he said. "I saw everything from behind the bar. Jim Walker didn't raise his voice, didn't touch anyone, didn't threaten anyone. Meanwhile, Carter Sloane came in here acting like a spoiled prince and terrorized my staff." He turned his gaze to Carter. "Your lies don't work here today." The firmness in Carlyle's voice carried weight no one expected. Weight built from being a lifelong local business owner who fed the town for years. Sergeant Hansen tensed visibly. Carlyle was too established to dismiss lightly. Hansen's jaw ticked as he looked between the townsfolk and Carter, the growing pressure eroding his certainty. Officer Lee, the young woman with a tight bun, finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Sergeant, the witnesses are all consistent." Benton nodded slightly, a subtle show of agreement. Hansen tried to salvage authority by puffing his chest. "We still received a report of a potential weapon." At that, Carlyle tilted his head. "Did you see a weapon?" Hansen's silence said everything. Jim remained calm, hands still raised, expression steady. Rex stood tall beside him, watchful but controlled. A veteran and a loyal dog. Not a threat, only protectors. Realizing his fabricated story was crumbling, Carter lunged toward justification. "You don't understand. He humiliated me. Being embarrassed isn't a crime," Carlyle cut in. The cafe murmured in agreement. Carter's composure shattered, entitlement mixed with desperation. "My father will hear about this," he barked, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Hansen inhaled sharply, weighing his options. Confront the entire town or stand with the Sloanes. His hand slid slowly off his holster. The room exhaled collectively, the tide turning as truth finally outweighed fear. Hansen muttered, "We'll file a report and follow protocol," the closest thing to admitting fault he could manage. Carter stared at Hansen, betrayed, then shot daggers at Jim, who hadn't moved. Jim's eyes met Carter's without malice, only the firm, undeniable truth that Carter had been stopped, not by force, but by integrity. Rex emitted a quiet huff, as if signaling the battle was already over. Martha, tears welling, whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure who she meant, Jim, Carlyle, or the entire room. Carter stormed out a second time, weaker than before. The officers followed, tension draining from their shoulders as they returned to their cruisers. The cafe slowly returned to stillness, but the moment lingered like a mark on the town's history. Jim lowered his hands and crouched to pat Rex's head. "Good job," he murmured. Carlyle placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. "You did right," Carlyle said. "But this isn't over." Jim nodded. He knew. Behind the humiliation, Carter had something far more dangerous: power, pride, and a father who ran the town. But today, the truth had stood its ground, and for the first time, Maple Ridge pushed back. Jim Walker stood quietly inside Harbor Crest Cafe as the atmosphere shifted from fear to disbelief. Moments earlier, chaos had gripped the diner, but now the truth stood tall and undeniable. Sergeant Roy Hansen, a heavy-set officer with a reddening face and graying hair, realized he had no ground left to defend Carter Sloane. Behind Jim, Rex, the 4-year-old German shepherd with sharp amber eyes and a muscular frame, pressed close in protective stillness. Martha Lane, the tired, middle-aged waitress whose life had been confined to double shifts and anxiety, wiped her trembling hands on her apron. Every witness in the cafe was staring at Carter, awaiting justice. Carter Sloane froze when 2 additional officers stepped inside. Officer Mark Rivers, mid-30s, tall, lean, with a square jaw and neatly trimmed beard, moved toward Carter with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with Carter's earlier arrogance. Officer Diane Holloway, a woman in her early 40s with a steady gaze and a sturdy build shaped by decades of police work, flanked Rivers. Neither officer carried the hostility of Sergeant Hansen. Rivers announced clearly that Carter was being detained under suspicion of filing a false police report and public endangerment. Carter's jaw dropped as anger and fear mixed in his blue eyes. As Officer Rivers took Carter's wrist, Carter tried to jerk away, but his motions were clumsy and desperate. His blonde hair, styled perfectly earlier, now fell over his forehead as he snarled about his father's influence and promised revenge on everyone who dared stand against him. Officer Holloway didn't flinch. She stepped forward with a practiced efficiency and clicked the handcuffs onto Carter's wrists, holding him firmly though not cruelly. For the first time, Carter looked small, just a spoiled young man whose entitlement had finally met consequences he could not buy off. Martha Lane watched the scene unfold, her breath unsteady. Her thin shoulders trembled slightly, not out of fear anymore, but out of release. She was a woman who had lived most of her 45 years with quiet endurance, caring for her elderly mother, enduring exhausting work hours, swallowing insults to keep her job. Now, as Carter was led toward the exit, Martha pressed a hand to her chest. Jim Walker noticed. With slow, steady steps, he approached her. Jim had the posture of a man who had carried burdens heavier than any seen by the people in the cafe, his military cold-weather parka bearing faint creases that spoke of long journeys. Martha's eyes glistened as Jim stood before her. She was not a fragile woman, but someone worn down by life's constant demands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft yet full of weight. "Nobody has ever stood up for me like that." Jim offered a gentle nod. He didn't smile, but his blue eyes softened. "You deserved better, ma'am," he said in a calm, deep voice, shaped by years of discipline. At his feet, Rex moved forward with slow and deliberate steps, brushing his head gently against Martha's leg. The action startled her, then made her exhale in an emotional relief she didn't expect. She knelt and stroked the dog's fur with gratitude. Outside the diner's windows, Carter continued yelling insults over his shoulder, but the officers ignored him. The flashing lights from their patrol cars painted the street in streaks of blue and red. Residents walking by slowed to watch, whispering as the heir to the wealthiest family in town was escorted into the back of a cruiser. Mayor Byron Kendrick, a slim man in his mid-50s, known for avoiding conflict, hurried across the street, his thinning hair ruffled by the warm wind. He approached Sergeant Hanson and spoke in urgent tones, glancing repeatedly at Carter in the patrol car. But the scene had grown bigger than politics. The diners inside had witnessed everything. Back inside, Carlisle Harper, the 58-year-old cafe owner with broad shoulders and a gruff voice, approached Jim. Carlisle had run Harbor Crest Cafe for decades, serving travelers, fishermen, and locals alike. His stern appearance hid a loyal heart worn down by years of keeping peace in a small town dominated by the Sloan family's power. "You did right," Carlisle said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. "This town needed to see someone stand up today." Jim gave a small nod, accepting the words not as praise but as acknowledgement. He had not acted for appreciation, only because doing nothing had not been an option. Rex circled around Jim's legs, alert but calmer now that danger had passed. The dog's disciplined posture showed he was trained to protect without violence, responding only when commanded. Customers quietly returned to their tables, though the energy had not settled. Martha's breathing steadied, and Frank Dillard, the bearded cook who had earlier emerged from the back, placed a hand on her shoulder in reassurance. He shot Jim a grateful look before returning to the kitchen. Jim knew he and Rex had become the center of every gaze in the diner, but neither lingered in the attention. Jim stepped back toward his booth, picking up the coffee he hadn't finished. The cup had cooled, but he took a sip anyway. The bitterness grounded him. Rex sat beside him, tail thumping lightly against the floor. Jim turned toward Martha once more. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. Martha nodded, brushing a loose strand of brown hair from her face. The gratitude in her eyes held more sincerity than any words could express. It was the first time in years someone had stepped into the storm on her behalf. When Jim finally stood to leave, the cafe had fallen into a soft hush, the kind that held respect, not fear. He fastened the parka around his shoulders, the thick material rustling slightly. The warm afternoon sun leaked through the cafe windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. As Jim walked toward the door, Rex stayed tightly at his side, ears upright and amber eyes scanning the room one last time. Carlyle followed them with his gaze, knowing instinctively that Jim and Rex were people the town needed, even if they wouldn't stay. Outside, the street had quieted again. Carter's furious shouts were swallowed as the patrol car door slammed shut. Officer Holloway nodded once at Jim, a simple gesture of respect from one protector to another. Jim acknowledged her with the slightest tilt of his head. The heat of Maple Ridge pressed against them as Jim took a step forward. Rex padded next to him, the loyal shadow that never needed words to communicate understanding. Together, Jim Walker and Rex walked down the sunlit street like wanderers with no destination except the next place where someone needed them. Their footsteps were steady, their silence purposeful. There was no grand applause, no farewell, just the unspoken truth that justice sometimes arrived quietly, delivered by those who carried no badge, only courage. And for a moment, Maple Ridge felt lighter, cleaner, braver. Jim didn't look back at the cafe. There was no need. What had to be done was done. The people inside knew the truth, and Martha Lane would no longer face cruelty alone. As the afternoon wind rustled the trees lining the riverside road, Jim placed a hand briefly on Rex's back. The dog leaned into the touch for a second, then resumed his watchful stride. They disappeared slowly toward the horizon, two unassuming guardians carrying their silent justice into whatever tomorrow held. In a town that seemed ordinary, God sometimes sends quiet miracles, like a veteran and his loyal dog appearing at the right moment to remind us that kindness is stronger than cruelty. In our daily lives, there are always people who need someone to stand up for them, and God calls us to step forward instead of turning away. If this story touched your heart, please share it to spread goodness, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to everyone watching.